Hey everyone, this is James here, going to be talking about a director that we've been talking about a lot on this year's episodes in particular, and that is Damiano Damiani. So if you followed the channel, you've probably seen a lot of the different videos that we've done, a lot of reviews of his different films, as well as a couple kind of episodes where we rank his Eurocrime and just talk about him a bit as a director. So this one is going to be similar but a little different, and I'm going to be talking about Damiano Damiani's Deep Cuts. So, yeah, as you might have, as might be obvious, I did kind of a walk through his filmography. I'd already seen a good chunk of his films up prior to this year, but wanted to kind of fill in some of the gaps, the films I had not seen, and rewatch some of those that I particularly enjoyed. And so, in general, he does have a very underseen filmography. I've said before, my introduction to him was probably when I was doing my spaghetti western deep dive, 2012, 2013, and I watched A Bullet for the General, and I looked at his filmography, and I was like, okay, this guy seems like he's kind of a one-hit wonder. His other spaghetti western, A Genius, Two Friends, and an Idiot, is not particularly beloved, and he did Amityville 2, question mark. So now fast forward to 2024, and Amityville 2 seems perhaps even more bizarre. I actually am quite fond of it, but it's really quite an oddity in the guy's filmography. And you wouldn't necessarily get a good idea of kind of his sensibilities from those two films. So while I still adore A Bullet for the General, I think he has a lot of stuff to offer, specifically in the Eurocrime genre, but just in general. Like, he is a director that not only has more than one good film, most of his films are good films. His batting average is quite high, and he, in the end, I kind of come to the conclusion that he's just very underrated and very underseen. So shout outs to people that are kind of working to rectify that, people like Radiance Films, who have released a good chunk of Damiani films. Also worth noting that another place that people of a certain era that watch television, specifically Italian television from the 80s, might know him from La Piovra, where he was kind of the showrunner for the first season. Very, very celebrated TV show. I have not seen it, so I cannot comment on that, but it does star Michele Placido, who is in Sicilian Connection from Damiani's films. So yeah, that's definitely something notable in kind of his whole career that probably is worth mentioning too. So why is he not very well known? Well, first of all, a lot of his films, well, definitely genre work, are most closely in or adjacent to the Eurocrime polizioteschi genre, which is just not the most well-seen genre. Another one that, I hope people will come around to and watch a lot of films from, because I think there's a lot of films worth checking out from. But it's not spaghetti westerns, it's not gialli, so it's one of those that just is a little underseen. I like the films almost just as much as gialli, if not more, so I think, for me at least, it's been a genre that I really want to shout out as much as I can from my very small kind of YouTube channel here, basically. And the other thing is his films, while they are Eurocrime polizioteschis, they don't feel like them. They don't sit in the same image as like an Umberto Lenzi or a Fernando De Leo or an Enzo Castellari film. There's a strong social consciousness to them. No one would call these films fascist, or at least it'd be a huge stretch. They're not very grindhouse at all. And those are all things that, people associate and like about the polizioteschi genre. So they're almost like this weird niche of this small genre over here of Italian films in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Worth noting that of the Italian crime films he has done, and he's done quite a few of them, half of them are mafia films, but they're not really Godfather type films, and they're in some ways closer to dramas rather than kind of action-centered ones. Not that they don't have action, just a lot of it is based off of strong characterizations and just kind of solid filmmaking all around. So thematically, he focused a lot on the corruption within institutions, government, so this goes beyond his mafia films too. I think you can really see a clear line. The Cosa Nostra trilogy that Radiance Films released, they released The Day of the Owl, How to Kill a Judge. Those two are both really, really mafia-centric, but the other film they released, The Case is Closed, Forget It, while it has some mafia elements to it, it's a lot based off of like the institution of prison and Italian prisons and those things, and it's very, very critical of them. So I think that's a very obvious comparison, but people like other films like Goodbye and Amen, focusing on the CIA, I Am Afraid, kind of more of a big government conspiracy, and then he goes back to the mafia a bunch too. So I think it's very clear to see sort of like the central kind of moralistic themes throughout his thing. So yeah, I would say he's definitely kind of the Eurocrime director that could probably branch over people that are less interested in the grindhouse elements of some of those films. Okay, so let's get into some of the different movies that I want to shout out. Okay, so first I'm going to be walking through these chronologically. There are 6 different films that I really want to recommend, and there are 6 I'm going to mention too that were first time watches for me, and just going to say some quick thoughts on them. So first up I want to recommend, and again chronologically, is Girolimoni, The Monster of Rome. This one on its surface looks like kind of a giallo or maybe a Eurocrime film, but really it's kind of a dark crime comedy, which is interesting because Sergio Leone in the end really regretted hiring Damiani to do A Genius, Two Friends, and an Idiot because he didn't have the same grasp for comedy. And I think part of that is just these are 2 very different strains of it. The Genius, Two Friends, and an Idiot is kind of the buffoonish spaghetti western comedy, and this it's a little more embedded kind of in society. So even in this dark comedy, he's making a lot of comments on fascism, the rise of fascism in here. And so basically the premise of this is there's a serial killer killing very young children in Rome, and very quickly we learn who that is. But we also see the investigation and how different people within these groups, the fascist group, the police group, are all kind of positioning and jockeying for position in order to frame this thing so they can have the most advantage of it. So it's a really solid film, and I think really worth recommending. Definitely kind of an oddity in his filmography, and it doesn't necessarily very clearly fit into any of the very popular Italian genres, but I think it's a very good film. Next up, and I am defining this by under 600 reviews on Letterboxd. Next up, I have I Am Afraid, which is just under 600 reviews too. Really recommend this one. I've recommended this every chance I can get. I think it might be my favorite Damiani film. Just a really, really great conspiracy thriller. Well acted. You got Gian Maria Voyante. You got Mario Adorf. And just a great Riz Ortolani score too. Lens by Luigi Cavalier. Everything just comes together in this one. Just very good film. Next up, Goodbye and Amen. Both of these I have reviewed on the show. This one is also working with a lot of the same people as I Am Afraid. Came out the same year, 1977. Great John Steiner performance. This is kind of set in a very contemporary hotel at the time, and kind of a hostage situation, some CIA intrigue and things like that. So I really like this film. It's a little less beloved than some of the other Damiani films, but Radiance recently released this. It looks great. I think the conclusion in particular shines. Some great uses of silhouettes and things like that, and some just great work in costume design and whatnot. So really highly recommend that one as well. Next up, I have A Man on His Knees. This one is really underseen. This, as well as The Warning, the next film, both star Julian Algema. A Man on His Knees is more of kind of the mafia film of those two. And it focuses more on kind of like the pervasive kind of octopus arms, to quote another Damiani project, that the mafia has in Sicily. So really, really effective film. I like a lot of the Damiani mafia films. It's a slow-moving film, a bit of a slow burn, so if you can adjust to its pacing and things like that, I think it's a very rewarding one. The Warning is kind of like I Am Afraid. It exists in kind of this conspiracy space. This one also stars Gemma. It stars Martin Balsam, who comes back from Confessions of a Police Captain, which was seen by too many people to recommend here. And it's just a very, very solid Eurocrime film. I think fans of the genre that want to kind of fill in some of the underseen gems that they have not seen, strongly recommend the last 4 films I talked about. Okay, and then last up, in terms of recommendations, I have a Tomas Milian and Elliot Gould kind of chamber piece, if anything, and it really is kind of a weird curiosity, and that is Massacre play from the end of the decade in the 80s. I think it's 1989, if I recall correctly. So I recently saw this. It didn't sound very interesting to me, but I went ahead and I took the leap, and I really liked it. It's about two directors whose careers went kind of in different ways. And the performances by Milian, who looks way more aged than he did in his Eurocrime films, even just 10 years earlier, and Gould are particularly fantastic in the film. Just a lot of kind of charisma coming off of Gould in particular. And this one, I would say, of the six I'm recommending, feels the least like a Damiani film. He's not necessarily criticizing an institution, at least certainly not very directly. But I do strongly recommend this if you can check this down. This has been seen by something like 40 people on Letterboxd, so definitely one that needs a little bit of love, and I think people are going to enjoy. I'm very curious why or how this was made. It just seems like a very interesting, odd little project that they did in kind of like this great Italian setting. Okay, so now I am going to go on to not recommendations necessarily, but just a couple of the new watches that I did. So from his early period in the 60s, these are both in black and white, Lipstick and Empty Canvas. I actually enjoyed Lipstick a fair amount. It's a very kind of like true-to-life Italian crime drama. You can say maybe a little bit of like kind of that neo-realist wave in it. And it doesn't quite feel like the later Damiani films to come, but there's a good attention to detail there, and I would say it's a pretty solid film. Empty Canvas, I did not enjoy at all. Apparently based off of a famous novel, I just found this to be very dull. I sometimes have a very hard time with kind of like these young, angsty type characters that are struggling with themselves. It just doesn't do much for me, so I would not give that a recommendation, although I suspect some people will get more out of it. Visually and stuff like that, it's actually pretty well done. It just, the characters and things like that were just not connecting with me at all. Next up, I have The Tempter, which is kind of Damiani taking on the Catholic Church in the mid-70s. Claudio Castanelli's in this. Pretty solid film, I would say. A good Morricone score. I think it's Morricone that did that. So it's interesting. I would say it's not quite as successful as some of his better films in the 70s, which is just about everything else. Next up, A Genius, Two Friends, and an Idiot. I actually found this, perhaps it's because my expectations were so low, I actually enjoyed this a little bit more than one would expect. That being said, it's not a great spaghetti western. There's a lot of kind of the buffoonish comedy in it. It's a little too long, but it has some stuff going for it. The opening scene is great. The scenery is fantastic. I think they shot a lot of it actually in Monument Valley rather than in Spain. I think for a spaghetti western completist, it's definitely worth checking out, but I would not say it's a particularly good film. Next up, I have probably my least favorite Eurocrime film that I have seen from him, The Sicilian Connection, starring Michele Placido from La Piovra. And it's interesting. This film, there is apparently an ambitious, longer version that's almost 3 hours long that might have been made for television. There are parts of this that I quite like, but I think it really suffers from just the two brothers in this film. The film is basically kind of a mafia one where Michele Placido gets called from New York back to Italy. It's also sometimes called Pizza Connection because he runs a pizza parlor in America. Not before he performs one assassination in America, which is great. But then he has a brother in Sicily, and it focuses a lot on kind of like their different dynamic, and I think a lot of that stuff just doesn't work very well. And I think for a filmmaker that is going to make longer than a 90-minute film, it becomes a little less forgivable when you linger on these things that just don't work very well. So it has some good things going for it, but in the end, I think it's not a Eurocrime film I would recommend. And finally, I have another film that I think is decent but not great, and that is The Inquiry, starring Keith Carradine as well as Harvey Keitel. Very interesting oddity, and I believe this came out in 1986, just a couple of years before Passion of the Christ. It focuses on kind of the investigation into trying to find Christ's body. Keith Carradine plays the Roman investigator who gets very caught up in the investigation, and Harvey Keitel plays Pontius Pilate. Interesting film. I can't say I loved it, but it does. It's certainly intriguing for kind of that Scorsese connection. The fact that he would make The Last Temptation of Christ a couple of years later with Harvey Keitel as well. Everyone's speaking English in it. Some of the sets and things like that are very well done. But for me at least, I found it to be a little too much of a slow-moving drama where you kind of know where it's heading anyways. So yeah, it was decent. I think if you really like biblical films and things like that, you might enjoy this one. It certainly stands out as being kind of an interesting one in Damiani's filmography. Okay, so that wraps up all of the Damiani kind of deep cuts I was talking about. Hope everyone enjoyed this episode. Let me know if there are some other ones from Damiani I should check out. I know there are still a few others on the list. I tried to hit most of the ones I could find. I could not track down Il Sicario, which is supposedly kind of this Hitchcockian film he did in the 60s. I really wanted to see that one. So if anyone has a way to check that out too, I'd be interested in that. Let me know how you like this episode. I'll see y'all next time. Cheers.